Florence Crawford had been riding for 11 days straight when her horse finally threw a shoe outside of Amarillo, and she decided right then that the universe could go straight to hell if it thought one lame mare was going to stop her from reaching New Mexico territory. She had started in Missouri, not the comfortable parts of Missouri, where merchants' wives drank tea on painted porches and schoolteachers marked papers in rooms that smelled of chalk and lemon oil. She had started in the rough eastern edge of Missouri, in a town called Kellerton that barely deserved to be called a town at all, where the saloon outnumbered the churches 3-1, and where women like Florence had two choices: marry badly or leave. Florence had chosen a third option that nobody had offered her, which was to use a dead woman's name and ride west until she found something worth arriving to. Her real name did not matter anymore. She had buried it along with everything else she could not carry. The dead woman had been David Rhodes. Florence had nursed David through 3 weeks of fever in a boarding house in Kellerton, had held her hand when she passed, and had listened to David's delirious final murmurings about a brother in New Mexico territory, a man named David Rhodes who owned land near a place called Cimarron, who had written David a letter every month for 7 years inviting her to come and start fresh. David had no one else. Florence had nothing to start with. The letter in David's coat pocket had seemed, in the desperate arithmetic of that cold November morning in 1878, like a door left open by accident. Florence had taken the letter. She had taken the name. She had not taken it lightly. She told herself David would have understood. She told herself this approximately 40 times a day, and only sometimes believed it. The journey from Missouri had taken her through Kansas territory first, riding a horse she had purchased with every last dollar she owned, a brown mare named Sadie who was solid and patient and who had, until the shoe incident outside Amarillo, been worth every penny of the $14 Florence had paid for her. She had ridden through prairie towns and dusty crossroads, past sunflower fields gone dry in the autumn chill, and through creek beds barely trickling in the November cold. She had slept under her bedroll twice, in a church once, in 2 different boarding houses, and in a farmer's barn outside of Liberal, Kansas, where a kind woman named Mrs. Pollock had fed her salt pork and cornbread and had not asked a single question that Florence could not honestly answer. Then she had crossed into Texas territory, which was not technically a territory but felt like its own country entirely, and had ridden southwest toward the New Mexico line through days that burned cold and bright and empty in a way that made Florence feel, simultaneously, very small and oddly free. Texas had a way of doing that, making you feel the full weight of your own insignificance and somehow finding that comforting. She had spoken to exactly 3 people of consequence in Texas before Sadie threw her shoe. One was a Mexican rancher named Mr. Esperanza, who had pointed her toward the right trail when she had missed her turn. One was a United States Marshal who had looked her over with professional suspicion at a way station and accepted her explanation that she was heading to family in New Mexico territory. The third was a young Comanche woman about Florence's own age, 24, who had watched Florence water Sadie at a creek and had said nothing, only watched with dark, careful eyes until Florence had said good morning in a voice that she hoped conveyed she was not a threat, and the woman had nodded once and ridden away, and Florence had thought about that nod for the next 2 days, wondering what it meant to have your homeland carved into territories by a government that had never asked your opinion. Florence was not unaware of injustice. She had grown up adjacent to it, had watched it operate on people who had less power than she did, and had felt the specific shame of benefiting from systems that ground other people down. It did not make her comfortable, and she did not look away from it, even out here where the land felt ancient and indifferent to the lines men had drawn across it. Now she stood in the dirt outside Amarillo with Sadie's left foreleg lifted and the shoe dangling at an angle that made even Florence, who was not a farrier, wince in sympathy. The town was another quarter-mile down the road. Florence shouldered her saddlebag, took Sadie's reins, and walked. Amarillo in November of 1878 was not yet the town it would become. It was a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main road like beads on a loose thread, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with a hand-painted sign that someone had made a spelling error on and nobody had corrected, a small hotel, a few houses, and a church whose white paint was already peeling in the dry Texas wind. Florence led Sadie straight to the blacksmith, a large man with forearms like fence posts and a pleasant face who looked at the shoe, looked at Sadie and quoted her a price that was fair. "You riding far?" he asked while he worked, making conversation in the easy manner of a man who liked the sound of human voices. "New Mexico territory," Florence said. He whistled low. "Alone, evidently." He glanced up at her, then back at the hoof. "You got family out there?" "I am going to my brother," she said, and the words came out smoothly, practiced now, but they still caught somewhere in her chest like a splinter. "He has a ranch near Cimarron." "Long ride still ahead," the blacksmith said. He drove a nail with efficient precision. 3-4 more days if the weather holds. Stay on the Santa Fe Trail as long as you can. There's a way station at Clayton where you can resupply. Tell Hector at the general store that Ben Marsh sent you, and he will not cheat you on grain. Florence thanked him with genuine feeling. Small kindnesses on a long road accumulated into something that felt almost like community, and she had been starved for community for a long time. She slept that night in the Amarillo Hotel, in a room barely bigger than a wardrobe but with a real mattress and a water basin, and she lay on her back in the dark and read David Rhodes's last letter from her brother for what must have been the 40th time. She had memorized it. She could have recited it backward, but she read it anyway, because it was the only solid thing she had. The letter was dated March of 1878. It said, "Eleanor, I have asked you to come every year for 7 years, and I understand if you have reasons for staying that you have not shared. But I want you to know the invitation stands and will always stand. I have 40 acres and a house with 2 bedrooms and more land than one man needs. I built the second bedroom for you. It has a window that faces east and gets good morning light. I am not lonely as such, but I think I would be less alone if you were here. Your brother, David." Florence folded the letter with care and set it on the nightstand beside the oil lamp. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about what kind of man builds a bedroom for his sister and fills it with east-facing light. She thought about what she was going to say when she arrived. She thought about what she would do when the deception unraveled, as she was increasingly sure it would, because Florence Crawford was a great many things, but she was not a fool, and she knew that a man who had known his sister for her whole life would notice within approximately 5 minutes that Florence was not her. She had a plan. The plan was not good, but it was all she had. She would explain. She would tell him about Eleanor, about the nursing, about the passing, about the letter. She would show him everything she had of Eleanor's, the letter, a small brooch Eleanor had pressed into her hand near the end, saying, "Give this to my brother if you ever find yourself near him." She would ask for nothing except perhaps a meal and a place to sleep one night before she moved on. She told herself she was not building a life on this trip. She was delivering a message. She was closing a door that had been left open. She was honoring Eleanor. She believed about half of that. The truth was that Florence Crawford had not had a destination in a very long time, and David Rhodes's letter had given her one, and the longer she rode toward it, the more it had started to feel like hers. Not the name, not the welcome, not the brother, just the direction, just the feeling of riding toward rather than riding away. She fell asleep with the lamp still burning and dreamed of nothing in particular. The next morning she was in the saddle before sunrise. The last 3 days of riding took her northwest out of Texas and into New Mexico territory along the edge of the Santa Fe Trail, through land that changed its personality every 10 miles. There were stretches of flat scrubland where the grass was pale gold, and the sky went on forever in every direction. And there were sudden rises where red rock broke through the earth like the bones of something enormous. And there were dry creek beds and juniper thickets, and once a stretch of open valley so wide and still and quiet that Florence pulled Sadie to a stop and just sat there breathing for a full 2 minutes because the beauty of it was almost aggressive. She stopped at Clayton as the blacksmith had suggested, found Hector, mentioned Ben Marsh's name, and got a fair deal on grain and a decent meal of beans and roasted corn. An old Jicarilla Apache man sat outside the trading post and watched her with mild curiosity as she resaddled. She nodded to him. He nodded back with the unhurried dignity of someone who had seen a great deal of this country's history and expected to see a great deal more. Florence thought about the territory she was riding through, about what it had been, and what it was in the process of being made into. New Mexico Territory in 1878 was a landscape in violent transition. It had been Spanish colonial territory, then Mexican, then claimed by the United States after the war with Mexico in 1848, and the people who had lived on it longest, the various Apache peoples, the Navajo, the Pueblo communities, had been fighting a losing battle against that transition for decades. The land grants were a mess of conflicting claims and legal battles. The Lincoln County War had broken out earlier that year, a violent feud between cattle ranching and mercantile interests that had turned parts of southern New Mexico into something resembling a battlefield. Florence had heard about it in the way stations and boarding houses along her route, heard the name Billy Bonney mentioned with a mix of admiration and alarm, and had been quietly grateful that Cimarron was in the northern part of the territory, Colfax County, which had its own set of troubles with the land grant situation, but at least was not presently hosting what everyone was calling a war. She rode into Cimarron on a Thursday afternoon in late November. The town sat in a valley beneath the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the mountains were something Florence was entirely unprepared for after the flat plains of Kansas and Texas. They rose up suddenly and dramatically, dark with pine and capped with early snow, and they had a way of making everything at their feet look both small and perfectly placed, like furniture arranged in a very large room. The town itself was a real town, more substantial than Amarillo, with a newspaper office, a hotel called the St. James that had a reputation Florence had heard mentioned twice on her journey, a general store, a bank, a school, several saloons and streets that were actually laid out in something approaching a grid. Florence stopped at the St. James Hotel, not to sleep there, which was beyond her remaining means, but because she had heard it was a good place to ask questions. The man behind the desk had the polished manner of someone who had decided to be civilized regardless of geography. "I am looking for the Rhodes Ranch," Florence said. "David Rhodes. I understand he has property outside of town." The clerk nodded without particular interest. "Rhodes' property is east of town, about 4 miles. Follow the main road out past the Hendrickson spread and then look for the split cottonwood by the creek. Turn north there. You will see the house from the road." "Thank you," she said. "You family?" he asked, with the slightly too casual tone of someone who collected information as a hobby. "Yes," Florence said, and walked out before he could ask which kind. She remounted Sadie and sat for a moment in the street, watching Cimarron go about its business. A wagon rolled past loaded with timber. 2 men she did not know were having a conversation outside the general store, with the animated hand gestures of people arguing about something they both cared about. A dog slept in the middle of the road with complete disregard for traffic. A woman hung washing on a line strung between 2 posts, her back to Florence, red hands moving efficiently in the cold air. 4 miles east, Florence took a long, slow breath of mountain air that tasted like pine resin and cold water and whatever was coming next. Then she clicked her tongue at Sadie and rode. She found the split cottonwood without difficulty. It was dramatically split, lightning struck at some point, the 2 halves leaning away from each other at wild angles but still growing, which Florence found privately encouraging. She turned north on a road that was more of a track, 2 ruts through winter-yellowed grass, and after about a 1/4 mile she saw the house. It was not what she had expected, though she had not fully articulated what she had expected. She had perhaps imagined a rough frontier shack, the kind of place a man alone builds when he has the skills but not the time to do more than what is necessary. What she saw instead was a low, solid house built of adobe and timber in the New Mexico style, with a covered porch running the length of the front and a stone chimney already sending up a thin ribbon of smoke into the cold afternoon sky. There were several outbuildings, a barn that looked well-maintained, a chicken coop, a structure that might have been a smokehouse. A corral held 4 horses. A kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter, its beds mounded and covered with straw. Someone had planted climbing roses along the porch, leafless now, but with the thick woody structure of a plant several years old, carefully tended. This was not a place put together in a hurry. This was a place someone had built with intention. Florence slowed Sadie to a walk as she came down the track toward the house. Her heart, which had been fairly disciplined during 11 days of hard riding, was now doing something irregular and unhelpful. She could feel the letter tucked inside her coat against her ribs. She could feel Eleanor's brooch in the inner pocket of her saddlebag. A dog came out from behind the barn, a large reddish-brown hound with a long face and a tail that wagged once, investigatively, before it sat down in the yard and watched her approach with calm brown eyes. Then the door of the house opened. Florence had thought about this moment for 11 days. She had rehearsed it, run through various scenarios, planned several different versions of what she would say. None of the versions had accounted for the actual physical reality of David Rhodes, who stood on the porch of his house in the late afternoon light with the expression of a man who had just heard something he wanted very much to believe. He was perhaps 28 or 29, tall and lean in the way of men who spent their days in physical labor, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He was wearing work clothes, canvas trousers and a heavy flannel shirt, and he had a bandana at his throat in a dark blue that brought out the gray of his eyes, which were the first thing Florence noticed because they were the color of the mountain sky about an hour before snow, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not name but felt across 30 feet of cold air. He came down the porch steps. He was smiling. It was the smile of someone who has been waiting a long time for something and is trying not to let on how long. Florence dismounted. Her legs were stiff from the saddle and she came down less gracefully than she would have liked, catching herself against Sadie's shoulder before straightening. She turned to face him as he crossed the yard, and she could see the moment the smile shifted. Not disappeared, just changed, adjusted to something more uncertain. He stopped about 10 feet from her. "You are not a leaner," he said. His voice was quiet and even and held no accusation, just the flat registering of fact, the way a man names what he sees. "No," Florence said, "I am not." The silence that followed was not angry. It was the silence of someone waiting for the rest of the story, which Florence thought was one of the more generous responses she could have hoped for. "My name is Florence Crawford," she said. "Eleanor passed away in November about a month ago in Kellerton, Missouri. I was with her. I nursed her for 3 weeks and I was holding her hand when she died. She was 32 years old and she was very brave about it, right to the end." Something moved across David Rhodes's face. It was not entirely hidden, and he did not seem to try to hide it. His jaw tightened and his eyes went briefly somewhere far away, and his hand came up and gripped the porch railing beside him with more force than was necessary. Florence waited. "What did she die of?" he asked. "Fever. We believed it was typhoid, though the doctor in Kellerton was not certain. She was weakened first by a hard winter and not enough food." He nodded slowly. "She never told me she was struggling." "I suspect she did not want you to worry," Florence said. "She spoke of you often in those last weeks. She called you the good one. She said you wrote to her every month for 7 years. "Every month," he confirmed, and there was something in those 2 words that contained a great deal more than 2 words could ordinarily hold. Florence reached inside her coat and removed the letter. She held it out to him. "This was in her coat pocket when she passed. I read it. I know I should not have, but I did. And I know that what I did after was worse." She paused. I used her name to get here. I told people I was David Rhodes traveling to family in New Mexico territory. I want you to know I am not proud of it, and I am not asking you to be fine with it. I came because she had the brooch you gave her, and I promised to return it. I came because the letter said there was a bedroom built for her, and I thought someone should tell you in person that she would have come if she could have. She told me so in those last days. She wanted to come. She just ran out of time. Florence reached into her saddlebag and removed the small brooch, a simple silver piece with a blue stone, and held that out too. David Rhodes stood in the yard of his ranch in the cold November light and looked at the letter and the brooch in Florence Crawford's outstretched hand and did not take them for a long moment. Then he took them. He looked at the brooch for a while. He pressed it briefly against his palm. "Come inside," he said finally. "Your horse needs water and you look like you have not slept properly in a week." Florence blinked. "I did not expect that response." "What did you expect?" She considered being diplomatic and then decided against it. "I expected to be sent away." "You rode 3 territories alone to bring me my sister's brooch," David Rhodes said, with the careful tone of someone measuring out words precisely. "I am not going to send you away tonight." He paused. "Tomorrow we can discuss what comes next. Tonight you eat and rest." Florence Crawford, who had not cried once in 11 days of hard riding, felt something behind her eyes go dangerously warm. She blinked it back with the efficiency of long practice. "Thank you," she said, and it came out smaller and more sincere than she had intended. He led Sadie to the corral while Florence carried her saddlebag, and he unsaddled the mare with practiced ease and checked her hooves without being asked, running his thumb around each shoe and nodding approval. "Good horse," he said. "She is," Florence agreed. "We have been through a lot together." Inside, the house was warm from a fire in the main room and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something savory on the iron stove. It was neat without being sparse. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace, a collection that surprised her, history and 1 or 2 novels, and a volume on animal husbandry and a worn Bible. There was a braided rug on the floor in colors that someone had chosen with care, not just grabbed from a barrel. The furniture was handmade but well-made, solid joints and smooth surfaces. On the wall near the door hung a framed piece of embroidery that said simply "Home" in blue thread, and Florence recognized the work as a woman's because she had done enough of it herself, and she thought it was probably Aline's, sent from Missouri at some point, and she looked away from it quickly. David ladled stew from a pot on the stove into 2 bowls and set them on the table with bread and butter and coffee. He sat down across from her and they ate in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 strangers who have already said the most important things and are now trying to figure out what to say next. "How far is it from Missouri to here?" he asked after a while. 11 days riding," Florence said. "Through Kansas and Texas into the territory. You rode alone the whole way." "Yes." He looked at her steadily across the table. "Why?" The question caught her off guard, which meant it was the right question. She set down her coffee cup. "I did not have anywhere else to go," she said honestly, "and I had made a promise, and I suppose—" She stopped. "You suppose what?" "I suppose I thought that if I was going to be using Aline's name and her direction in the world, I should at least complete the errand she never got to complete herself." She met his eyes. "It was the least I could do under the circumstances." "Under the circumstances," he repeated, not sarcastically, just thoughtfully, as if he was turning the phrase over and examining all of its sides. "What happens after tonight? Do you have somewhere to go from here?" "Not specifically," Florence said. "I thought I might find work in Cimarron. I can sew and cook and I am good with figures. I worked as a bookkeeper for 2 years in Missouri. I imagine there is someone in Cimarron who needs someone with those skills." "There likely is," he said. "The town is growing." He was quiet for a moment. "You can stay here for a few days while you get your bearings. There is the east bedroom." He stopped as if the words had caught on something. "Aline's room," he said quietly. "Though I suppose it is just a room now." Florence did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Sometimes nothing was the most honest response. After supper, she helped him clear the table, which seemed to mildly surprise him, and then she asked if she could wash up, and he showed her where the water basin was in the smaller room off the kitchen, and gave her a towel that was clean and rough from line drying. And she washed her face and hands and neck and looked at herself in the small mirror hung above the basin. She looked like someone who had been riding for 11 days, which was to say she looked tired and sun-darkened, and with her brown hair escaping its braid in various creative directions. And she thought that a leaner had probably been prettier, being fairer and more delicate in feature, and that this was yet another way in which Florence was a poor substitute. She settled into the east bedroom and found it exactly as Alina's brother had described it. Small and simply furnished with a narrow bed and a quilt in shades of green, a dresser, and a window that faced east. The window glass was clean. The room had been swept. The quilt had been aired. He had kept it ready for 7 years, and the care of that struck Florence somewhere deep and tender, and she lay on the bed in her clothes without blowing out the lamp and stared at the east-facing window and thought about what kind of man maintains a room in hope for 7 years. She was asleep before the lamp burned low. She woke to the sound of him leaving the house before dawn, the soft close of the door, the crunch of boots on frost. She lay still for a moment listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up, the low sound of horses, the distant complaint of chickens, the creak of the barn door. Then she rose and dressed and went to the kitchen and built up the fire and put coffee on, because it seemed the least useful thing she could do, and because she had spent the last 11 days doing nothing useful except moving herself from one place to another, and her hands wanted work. When David came back in from the morning chores, she had coffee ready and had found salt pork in the larder and was slicing it for the pan. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she could not read because she did not know him well enough yet to read his expressions, and then he took off his hat and hung it by the door. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," Florence said. "How do you take your coffee?" "Black," he said. "Same as it comes." He sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup she slid toward him and drank with the appreciative silence of a man who has been out in the November cold for 2 hours. Florence served the salt pork and sat down across from him with her own plate, and they ate together again, and this time the silence was a little easier, worn smooth by a night of being in proximity. "I am going to ride into Cimarron this morning," he said. "I need to speak with someone at the land office. You are welcome to come." "I would like that," she said. "I can start asking about work." He nodded. "I also need to tell you something about Cimarron before we go." Florence looked at him. "The Colfax County situation is not simple," he said, choosing his words with the deliberateness of someone who has thought about how to explain a complicated thing. "There is a land grant that covers most of this region, the Maxwell Land Grant. The grant changed hands several years ago, and the new owners have been pushing settlers off land they have farmed for years. Some of those settlers are Anglo, some are Hispanic families who have been here since before New Mexico was American territory at all. There is a lot of anger. There have been some violent incidents. The town is fractious." He paused. "I am telling you this because a stranger riding in alone might hear things that sound alarming, and I want you to understand the context." Florence appreciated the briefing, which was delivered without condescension. "Which side are you on?" she asked. The directness of the question seemed to please him. "I am on the side of the families who have been here longest," he said. "My own land title is clean. I bought it through proper channels and have a clear deed, but I have neighbors who are not so fortunate, and I do not believe the law as it is being applied here is just." He met her eyes. "I say this so you know where I stand." "Then we are in agreement," Florence said, "on where we stand." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Just a small thing, a slight unclenching, like a door opening an inch. They rode into Cimarron together, Florence on Sadie and David on a dark bay gelding. He called charcoal for reasons that were not entirely clear given that the horse was brown, but Florence did not ask about that yet. The morning was cold and brilliant, the kind of November cold that came with a sky so blue it looked painted, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were sharp and white-capped against it and made Florence feel, as they had the day before, like she had arrived somewhere that mattered. Cimarron was busy for a morning. The main street had wagons and horses, and people moving with the purposeful bustle of a town that had things to accomplish. Florence noticed that many of the people were Hispanic, men in the wide-brimmed hats of the region and women with dark rebozos wrapped against the cold, and that some of the signs on the businesses were in both English and Spanish, and she filed this away as part of understanding the place she had arrived in. David stopped first at the land office, a small building near the end of the main street, where a conversation was already in progress between the office keeper and a man Florence did not know, conducted in voices low enough to suggest it was not going well. David waited outside, leaning against the hitching rail with patient ease, and Florence took the opportunity to step into the general store next door. The general store was run by a woman, which Florence had not expected, and which immediately raised her estimation of Cimarron. The woman was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered and practical-looking, with a silver streak through her dark hair and an expression that said she had seen a great deal and been surprised by very little of it in the last decade. Her name, Florence would learn in the next few minutes, was Margaret Torres, and she had run the store with her husband until he died 4 years ago of a kicked horse, and she had run it alone since then with the assistance of her teenage son, who was currently in the back unloading flour sacks with a rhythmic thumping that punctuated their conversation. "New in town?" Margaret asked, which was not exactly a question so much as an opening for Florence to explain herself. "Just arrived yesterday," Florence said. "I am looking for work. I have bookkeeping experience and I sew and cook. I heard there might be opportunities." Margaret studied her with frank assessment. "You ride in alone?" "From Missouri." The eyebrows went up fractionally. "That is a long ride for a woman without family." "I have found," Florence said carefully, "that the distance seems longer if you think about it all at once. If you just think about today's riding, it is manageable." Margaret Torres made a sound that might have been a laugh repressed into a hum. "Where are you staying?" "At the Rhodes Ranch east of town, temporarily." Something in Margaret's expression shifted, becoming more interested. "David Rhodes's place?" "Yes. Good man," Margaret said, with the matter-of-fact tone of a final verdict. "Helped me haul supplies when my wheel broke last February. Did not make a thing of it." Some men around here would have used a favor like that as a debt to collect. He just did it. She paused, arranging a row of tin goods with practiced efficiency. "I could use help with the accounts on Thursdays and Fridays," she said. "I cannot pay much, but it is honest pay and I am not hard to work for. Ask anyone." Florence felt something loosen in her chest. "I would be grateful for the work." "Come by Thursday then," Margaret said, and turned to address the thumping from the back. "Miguel, carefully with those sacks. They are not the enemy." Florence was smiling when she stepped back out into the street, where she found David waiting for her with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully concluded an unpleasant business, and also the slightly questioning look of a man who has just been told by the land office keeper that the woman staying at his ranch had come into the hotel asking questions about him the previous afternoon. "Apparently, you announced yourself in Cimarron before you reached my place," he said, without accusation. "I asked the hotel desk for directions," Florence said. "I did not realize I was starting a rumor." "In a town this size, asking directions is starting a rumor," David said, and the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was related to one. They ate lunch at a small establishment run by a woman named Rosa who served beans and tortillas and chili verde that was the best thing Florence had eaten since leaving Missouri. David paid, which she did not argue about because she had approximately $6 remaining to her name and needed to conserve them, But she told him she would pay the next time, and he nodded as if this was a reasonable statement of intent rather than a social nicety. On the ride back to the ranch in the afternoon, they talked. Not about Alina, not about the circumstances that had brought Florence to New Mexico territory, but about other things. About the ranch and what he was raising, primarily cattle but also some horses, and about the land and how he had come to acquire it 8 years ago at the age of 20, when he had ridden west from Missouri with $400 and a stubbornness that had turned out to be an asset. About the books on his shelf, and she mentioned the one on history, and he said he had been reading about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, because he thought it was important to understand the history of the land you lived on, and Florence said she agreed entirely. About the mountains, which he said never got ordinary to him no matter how long he looked at them. "What made you stay in Kellerton?" he asked at some point. "If you do not mind my asking." Florence thought about it. "Inertia," she said, "and a job that was tolerable and not enough reason to leave until I had one." "And Alina gave you a reason." "Alina's letter gave me a direction," Florence said, correcting him gently. "A reason was my own business." He glanced at her sideways, and she kept her eyes on the trail, and neither of them said anything more about it for the rest of the ride. The days settled into a shape. Florence was, by nature and by long habit, a person who needed shape. She rose early and made coffee, and was usually halfway through starting breakfast by the time David came in from morning chores. And they ate together, and then he rode out to work the range. And she set about the tasks of the house with the same thoroughness she applied to everything, because idleness made her anxious, and because the house was clearly the domain of one person who did his best but had other priorities. She discovered that the climbing roses on the porch had been Alina's, sent as bare root cuttings in a parcel years ago from Missouri, and that David had planted them and watered them and pruned them carefully in the autumn each year, even though he professed to know nothing about roses. Consulting a gardening almanac she found tucked on the shelf between the Bible and the history book with the page on climbing roses well thumbed. She did not say anything about the almanac. She just thought about it privately for several days. On Thursdays and Fridays, she rode into Cimarron and worked for Margaret Torres, who was indeed not hard to work for, being direct and competent and appreciative of both qualities in others. The accounts were in more disorder than Margaret liked to admit, and Florence spent the first 2 weeks simply organizing them before she could begin the actual work of keeping them. And Margaret watched her do this with the expression of someone trying very hard not to be visibly relieved. Florence also, in those 2 weeks, became acquainted with the social geography of Cimarron. She understood by the end of the first week who the allies were and who the enemies were in the ongoing land dispute. She understood that David Rhodes was respected, and that his refusal to take a purely political position on the Maxwell land grant dispute, while frustrating to the more radical elements on both sides, was the position of a man who was trying to be just rather than popular, which she found clarifying. She met his neighbors, a family named Vasquez who had farmed the quarter section west of the Rhodes land for 30 years, and whose patriarch, Don Archero Vasquez, had a legal claim that the Maxwell Land Grant Company was contesting with what everyone agreed was very thin evidence. Don Archero was 70 years old and had the bearing of a man who had outlasted several governments and expected to outlast several more. His daughter-in-law, Lucia Vasquez, was close to Florence's age and had a sharpness of mind that found Florence interesting in turn. "You are not what I expected of a woman who rode from Missouri alone," Lucia said, the second time they met over coffee at the Vasquez house. "What did you expect?" Florence asked. "Someone rougher," Lucia said, with a smile that made it a compliment. "You are smooth, like a knife that has been properly honed." Florence laughed, which was apparently unexpected and which seemed to settle something between them. "I have had a long time to practice being smooth," she said. "It is a defensive skill." "All the best ones are," Lucia agreed, and handed her more coffee. It was Lucia who, about 3 weeks after Florence's arrival, said something that forced Florence to articulate what was happening with more clarity than she had so far allowed herself. They were walking back from visiting the Vasquez house to where Florence had tied Sadie, and Lucia said, very casually, in the way of someone who has been thinking about something for a while and has decided to say it, "David Rhodes has not had a woman in this house in 8 years. He has not been courting anyone. He has not, from what I can see, been interested in anyone, until now." Florence stopped walking. "Lucia, I am not wrong," Lucia said, equally casually. "He is being hospitable," Florence said. "His sister died. I brought him news of her. He is kind." "He is kind," Lucia agreed. "He is also not looking at you the way a man looks at a person he is merely being hospitable toward." Florence had nothing useful to say to that, so she said nothing. She thought about it on the ride back, and again that evening when she and David sat by the fire after supper and he read, and she sewed a tear in her riding skirt that had been getting larger in an alarming direction. It was a quiet evening, the kind of evening that was simply two people being in the same space without demanding anything of each other, and the quality of that quiet was something Florence had not experienced in years, maybe ever. She caught herself looking at his hands while he turned a page and thought about what Lucia had said, and then applied herself to the seam with renewed vigor. After a moment, David looked up, not at her face but at whatever she was working on, and said, "I thought I saw thread and needle in the sewing basket, top shelf in the kitchen. You do not have to use that." "I found them," Florence said. "I borrowed them. I hope that is fine." "Everything in this house is available to you," he said, and returned to his book, and the simplicity of it hit her somewhere she had not expected to be vulnerable. She was falling in love with him. She had known it for at least 10 days and had been managing it with the same efficient containment she applied to everything that was inconvenient or inadvisable, and it was not working anymore. The problem, or one version of the problem, was that she still did not fully know where she stood. She was Florence Crawford, not Alina Rhodes. She had used his sister's name to get here. Whatever hospitality he was extending, whatever warmth there was between them now, it had started in a deception she had committed. Even if she had confessed it immediately, and even if he had been generous about it, the foundations were complicated. The other version of the problem was simpler. She was a woman alone with no property and no family and a bookkeeping job 2 days a week, and he was a man with 40 acres and a house and 8 years of work built into the land. And she did not want him to think she was here for those things, because she was not. She was here because she had not wanted to leave, and she was starting to understand that she had not wanted to leave because of him, and she needed to be honest about the order of those things. She told Lucia about it on the following Friday while walking back from the general store. "You are making it more complicated than it is," Lucia said, with the practical clarity of someone happily married who could see simple things from the outside. "How is it not complicated?" "He knows who you are," Lucia said. "He has known from the first minute. He did not send you away. He has not sent you away in 3 weeks. He watches you like you are weather coming, and he is trying to decide whether to be worried or grateful." She paused. "Talk to him." "What do I say?" "The truth," Lucia said, "which you already know." The opportunity came sooner than Florence expected and more awkwardly than she would have preferred, which was the way of important moments in general. She had been in the kitchen that Saturday afternoon when she heard him come in, not from outside but from the direction of Alina's room, the east bedroom, which she had noticed him visit once or twice, briefly, with the expression of a man tending to something he needed to acknowledge. She came out of the kitchen and they nearly collided in the hallway, and he stepped back and she stepped back and they both stood there in the narrow corridor of the house, and the proximity was different than it had been, charged with something that had been building long enough to find its own pressure. "I was going to ask you something," Florence said, because standing there was worse. "All right," David said. "When you let me stay," she said. "When you told me I could have the room. Were you being kind because of Alina, or were you being kind because of me?" The question was directness beyond what was polite or safe, and she knew it as she said it. But she had crossed 3 territories to get here, and she had not come this far to be indirect at the last moment. David Rhodes looked at her in the narrow hallway of his house and did not answer immediately, which she had come to understand was his way. He thought before he spoke always, and the thinking was real thinking, not just gathering himself. He was the kind of man who meant what he said, and so he took care about what he said. Both, he said finally. At first, because of Alina, because you brought her home to me in the only way she could come. But after the first morning, when you had the coffee ready and you asked me how I take it, after that it was because of you. Florence breathed. I want to say something, he said, and there was something in his tone that was careful but not hesitant, like a man carrying something fragile but not afraid of the weight. I have been living alone out here for 8 years and I have been fine with it. I am not a man who needs a great deal from people. But you have been here 3 weeks and the house is different. Not just cleaner or more organized, though it is both of those things. He paused. It is different because you are in it. And I find that I am not interested in going back to the way it was before. Florence was very still. I do not know what you want, he said. I know you have work in town, and I know you have been building a life here that does not depend on me. I am not asking you to give any of that up. I am just telling you what is true so that you know it, and so that whatever you decide it with the full information. Florence Crawford, who had ridden through Kansas and Texas and into New Mexico territory with a dead woman's name and a borrowed direction, and nothing much to her name but stubbornness and capability, and the careful habit of not letting people see the whole of her, looked at this man in his own narrow hallway, and felt the full information settle into her bones like warmth after cold. My name is Florence Crawford, she said, and I'm not going anywhere. Something opened in his face, not dramatically. Just that inch of a door again, but this time it swung wider, and he was across the narrow hallway and his hands were at her face, cupped carefully at her jaw, and he kissed her with the thoroughness of a man who had been thinking about it longer than he had admitted. She kissed him back with everything she had been managing and containing for 3 weeks, and it turned out that was quite a lot. Winter came to the Cimarron Valley in December, with the quiet authority of something that had done this many times before. The mountains went white from peak to mid-slope, and the mornings came with frost thick on the grass, and the breath of the horses making small clouds in the cold. Florence had been at the ranch for 6 weeks when the first real snow fell, a clean, steady snowfall that began in the late afternoon and continued through the night. And she stood on the porch in the early morning after, and looked at the world made white and new, and felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten the word for it. She felt at home. David came to stand beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and handed her one, and they stood together looking at the snow and the mountains, and the way the morning light was turning the white surfaces gold, and his arm came around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and they stayed that way for a long while without speaking, because nothing needed to be said. The situation of her name, the false name, the borrowed direction, was settled in a particular way she had not anticipated. It had happened 2 weeks after the conversation in the hallway, when she and David had been sitting together in the evening, and she had raised the subject again, needing to have it out completely, needing him to understand the full weight of what she had done. I need you to know, she said, that I am not asking for forgiveness exactly. I know what I did was wrong. I took your sister's name. I used it to travel safely when I would not have been able to travel as safely without it, or to be believed when I said I was going to family. I am not excusing it. David set down his book. He looked at her steadily. Do you know what I think about when I think about what you did? She shook her head. I think about Alina in that boarding house in Kellerton having no one. His voice was quiet and level. And then I think about a stranger sitting with her and nursing her for 3 weeks, holding her hand when she died, not leaving her alone. He paused. Whatever name you used to get here, Florence, you did not take something that was not yours. You earned the right to use that direction. Alina sent you here as surely as if she had written the letter herself. Florence looked at the fire for a long moment. "She gave me the brooch," she said. "She said give it to my brother. I do not know if she knew what she was giving me along with it." "Maybe she did," David said simply. Eleanor was not a foolish woman. Florence thought about that for a long time afterward, whether Eleanor had known, whether there had been something deliberate in the giving, some final act of generosity from a woman who had nothing left to give except a direction and a name and a set of open arms at the other end of it. She would never know for certain, but she had held the possibility of it carefully, and it had helped. Christmas came to the Cimarron Valley with the Vasquez family at the Rhodes table, which had been expanded with a board from the barn to seat Don Archero and his son Felipe and Lucia, and their 3 children, ranging in age from 5 to 11, plus Margaret Torres and her son Miguel, who was 16 and serious, plus a man named Thomas Hale, who was David's closest friend, and who operated a small horse trading operation outside of town, and who Florence had met twice before and liked for his dry humor and his complete lack of interest in drama. The table was crowded and loud, and the food was abundant because everyone had brought something, and Florence had made 2 pies with dried apples she had been saving for the occasion, and they were consumed with the speed of appreciation that meant no effort was required to feel good about having made them. Don Archero gave a toast in Spanish that Lucia translated, in which he said, with the authority of a man who had been paying attention for 70 years, that the best thing that could happen to any house was to have someone in it who wanted to be there, and that this was the only true foundation of anything worth having. He looked at Florence when he said it, and then at David, and then raised his glass. Florence met David's eyes across the table, and the warmth between them was visible enough that Thomas Hale leaned over to Miguel Torres and said something in a low voice that made the boy grin. The land dispute with the Maxwell Land Grant Company was a thread that ran through the whole winter with increasing tension. In January, the Land Grant Company's agents attempted to serve eviction papers on the Vasquez family, citing a clause in the original land grant that the Vasquez family's attorney in Santa Fe argued was not applicable to land held under continuous occupation and cultivation for more than 20 years. David rode with Felipe Vasquez to Cimarron 3 times in January to meet with the county sheriff, a man named Harkins who was trying to stay neutral in a situation that made neutrality increasingly expensive, and to consult with other settlers who were facing similar pressures. Florence went with him twice. She had, by this point, been keeping Margaret Torres' accounts for 6 weeks and had developed a clear picture of how the local economy worked and who owed what to whom, and this made her useful in ways that went beyond moral support. On the second trip, she sat in the back of the meeting at the courthouse annex and listened to 8 men argue in 2 languages about what the law said and what justice required. And at the end of it, when they had talked themselves into a circle, she said from the back of the room, "Does anyone have the original land grant documents, the actual documents, not the land grant company's summary of them?" There was a pause. "Because if you are going to argue about what the grant says," Florence continued, "it would help to have the grant." Felipe Vasquez looked at her. Don Archero, who had come along to observe, made a sound that might have been approval. David, sitting 2 rows in front of her, did not turn around, but she could see by the set of his shoulders that he was trying not to smile. As it turned out, the actual documents were in Santa Fe and nobody in Cimarron had a full copy, and the meeting ended with a plan to obtain them, which was at least a more actionable conclusion than anything that had been discussed in the previous 2 hours. David did not say anything about it until they were halfway home in the dark, riding side by side under a sky so full of stars that it seemed almost wasteful. "Where did that come from?" he asked. "From 8 years of keeping books," Florence said. "If you want to know what a situation really is, read the primary document. Everything else is someone's interpretation." "Remind me never to argue with you about anything contractual," he said. "That is good advice," she agreed. He reached over in the dark and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn briefly, just for a moment, and then let go, and they rode the rest of the way home in the clear, cold dark with the mountains all around them. By February, Florence had been in New Mexico territory for 3 months, and her life had taken on a shape that fit her better than anything she had worn since she was young enough not to need armor. The bookkeeping work with Margaret had expanded from 2 days to 3 and now included helping organize the records for 2 other businesses in town, a task she handled with the methodical satisfaction of someone doing exactly the work they are suited for. She had repaired and improved the kitchen garden beds in anticipation of spring. She had mended every piece of clothing in the house that needed it and made 2 new shirts for David, because she had noticed that his were worn at the elbows, and because she was good at sewing, and because it gave her a quiet pleasure to make something useful for someone she loved. She had said it to herself, that word, approximately 40 times by now, and she had stopped qualifying it with considerations and conditions. She loved him. It was one of the simpler true things in her life, which had not contained a great many simple true things. What she had not yet said was whether she intended to stay permanently, not because she did not know, but because the question of how had not yet resolved itself. She had not been asked to stay permanently. She had been asked, implicitly, in every way that mattered but not in words, and Florence was a woman who understood the difference. The asking, when it came, was on a Sunday in March, when the first real warmth of the coming spring had broken through the cold, and the climbing roses on the porch had put out their first tentative green shoots, and the mountains still held their snow, but the valley was beginning to remember that it knew how to be warm. They had ridden out that morning to check the condition of the east pasture fence after winter, a practical errand, and had ended up sitting on a low red rock shelf above the creek where the sun fell directly and watching the water move, which was full and fast with snowmelt and very clear, and she had taken off her hat, and the sun was warm on her hair and everything was very still. "I have been thinking about something," David said. "Tell me," Florence said. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that the answer does not change anything between us," he said, with the careful precision he always brought to important sentences. "Whatever you say, you are welcome here, and that does not end." Florence turned to look at him. The morning light was on the side of his face, and there was something in his expression that was both steady and more open than she usually saw, like the inside of something that usually kept its shutters. "Florence Crawford," he said, "will you marry me?" She had known it was coming in the way you know a season is turning, by the cumulative weight of small signs. She had not known it would hit her this hard. She sat on the warm red rock above the snowmelt creek in the morning sun of a New Mexico territory spring, and felt the full weight of everything it had taken to arrive at this moment. The leaving, the writing, the borrowed name and the honest confession, and the 3 weeks of careful orbiting before the gravity of it had become undeniable. And she thought about Alina in that boarding house in Missouri, and the letter in the coat pocket, and the east-facing window, and the 7 years of monthly letters, and the rose cuttings planted with the help of a gardening almanac. "Yes," she said, "I will." He kissed her on the red rock shelf above the creek, and the sunlight was warm, and the water moved fast and clear below them, and somewhere in the valley, one of the horses in the corral made the long, loud sound of a horse that has spotted something interesting, which was so thoroughly unremarkable and perfectly timed that Florence laughed against his mouth and felt him laugh too. They were married in Cimarron in April of 1879, at the church whose white paint was now slightly less peeled because the congregation had repainted it in March, partly because it needed it, and partly because Florence had organized the effort with the cheerful relentlessness she brought to any project she identified as necessary. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, a compact, energetic man named Reverend Matthias, who married and buried and baptized his way across New Mexico territory on a circuit that covered several hundred miles, and who had the practiced kindness of someone who had sat with people in all the significant moments of their lives. Margaret Torres stood with Florence. Thomas Hale stood with David. The Vasquez family filled 2 rows, with the children in varying states of formal attire and varying degrees of patience about it. Several other Cimarron residents filled the rest of the church, because a wedding in a small town is never a small occasion. And besides, people liked David Rhodes and they had come to like Florence Crawford, and the combination of the two struck the town as both inevitable and correct. Florence wore a dress she had made herself in the previous weeks, in a deep blue color that was more practical than white, and suited her better besides, with small buttons down the front and a hem that was sensible for a woman who intended to walk out of the church and continue to live her life. She carried climbing rose branches from the porch, not yet blooming, but with the tight early buds of late April beginning to show color. Don Arturo Vasquez gave another toast at the celebration afterward, held at the Vasquez house because it was the largest available space, and this time he did not need Lucia to translate because he gave it in English out of respect for the occasion, and what he said was, "A man who builds a room for someone who has not yet arrived is a man who understands that love is an act of faith. A woman who rides through 3 territories on that faith, not knowing whether it would hold, is a woman who understands that faith requires movement." He raised his glass. May they always be in motion toward each other. Florence held David's hand under the table and pressed it once firmly, and he turned his thumb over hers, and they did not say anything, which was, between them, a language they had become fluent in. The land dispute with the Maxwell Land Grant Company took a turn in May that was more positive than anyone had dared to hope. The full original land grant documents, obtained from Santa Fe through the efforts of Felipe Vasquez and 2 other settlers who had ridden down together in March, contained a provision that the Land Grant Company's lawyers had quietly omitted from their summary, a provision that explicitly protected continuous cultivation rights for families in occupation for more than 15 years. Don Arturo Vasquez had been farming his land for 30 years. The case went to the territorial court and was argued over the summer, and while it was not a simple or a swift process, and while Florence did not pretend the system was just merely because it occasionally produced a just outcome, the Vasquez family received a judgment in their favor in August of 1879, and the land was confirmed as theirs. And Don Arturo Vasquez sat on his porch that evening and looked at his fields and said nothing for a long time and then said, in Spanish, something Lucia translated for Florence as, "I am glad I stayed." Florence thought about staying, about choosing to stay versus having nowhere to go. About how, if you were fortunate, and if you worked at it, and if the right circumstances aligned themselves, the 2 things could eventually become the same. Summer on the Rhodes Ranch was work, the steady, satisfying work of land that responded to attention. Florence had planted the kitchen garden in April, and it came in with the aggressive productivity of good soil properly prepared, tomatoes and beans and squash and onions, and enough herbs to scent the whole kitchen when she tied them to dry from the ceiling. She learned, over the summer, more about the cattle operation than she had expected to want to know, and found that she had opinions about it, which David received with the equanimity of a man who had long since determined that his wife's opinions were an asset rather than a complication. She helped him decide to add 10 more head in July when the price was good. She reorganized the accounts of the ranch operation with the same efficiency she brought to Margaret Torres' books, and identified 3 places where money was going out with less purpose than it should, and redirected it. David looked at her revised accounts for a long moment, then looked at her, then said, with the dry understatement she had come to love, "I think I was doing this wrong before." "You were doing it well enough," Florence said. "We are just doing it better." He put his arm around her at the kitchen table and pressed his lips to the top of her head and said, against her hair, "Yes, that is exactly right." Thomas Hale came for supper once a week, on Wednesdays, which had begun as a practical arrangement, and had evolved into something closer to ritual. He was one of those people who made a house feel more like itself when they were in it, easy and unsentimental and genuinely funny in the way that did not perform itself. He and Florence had arrived at an alliance that rested partly on their shared appreciation of David's particular brand of quiet intensity, and partly on a mutual understanding that they were both, in their different ways, people who had wound up somewhere they had not expected to be, and had found it more suitable than anywhere they had been before. "You are good for him," Thomas told Florence once, in October, while David was outside checking on a horse that had seemed off its feed. "I know," Florence said, which was not modesty but was not arrogance either. It was just accurate. "He built that east bedroom for a leaner," Thomas said. "I thought for years that he was going to be that man forever, the one who keeps a room ready for someone who never comes." He paused. "Then you came, and the room is not empty anymore." Florence stirred the stew she was tending without answering immediately. Then she said, "I came in a leaner's name. I want you to know that I know what that means." "Do you think a leaner would have objected?" Florence thought about it carefully, as she had thought about it many times. "No," she said finally. "I think she would have been glad the room was being used." "I think so too," Thomas said, and that was the end of it. In November of 1879, exactly 1 year after Florence Crawford had arrived at the Rhodes Ranch with a borrowed name and a dead woman's brooch, she found out she was expecting a child. She told David on a cold, clear evening after supper, while they were sitting by the fire in the way they had sat by the fire for a year now, in the particular easy arrangement that felt like it had always existed. She put down her sewing and said, without preamble because she had never learned to be coy, "I am going to have a baby in the spring." David looked up from his book. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had learned, over the course of a year, to read fully. It was the expression of a man who was feeling something large and finding the right proportion for it. He closed the book. He came across to where she was sitting on the settee and sat down beside her and took her face in his hands, the way he had in the hallway that first night she had not expected, and looked at her with everything he had, all of it completely visible and unguarded. "You gave me back my sister," he said quietly, "and now you are going to give me a family." Florence felt the warmth behind her eyes with the same intensity she had felt on that first day in his yard, and this time she did not blink it back. "I did not mean to take on so much," she said, and her voice was uneven. "I am very glad you did," he said, and kissed her, and held her for a long time in the warm room with the fire going and the mountains holding their snow just beyond the glass of the east-facing window. And Florence Crawford, whose name was now Florence Rhodes, let herself be held. The baby came in late April of 1880, which was spring proper in Cimarron, with the climbing roses putting out their first full blooms, and the valley gone green and warm, and full of the urgent, noisy business of things growing. It was a long day, attended by a woman named Eliza Cooper, who served as the town's midwife with steady competence, and Lucia Vasquez, who had refused to go home after coming to check on Florence in the morning, and had stayed through everything with practical, capable support, and David, who had been told to stay in the kitchen, and had done so with the coiled tension of a man trying very hard to follow instructions. The baby was a boy, born in the room with the east-facing window and the green quilt, in the last light of the afternoon. David came in when it was permitted and sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at his son with the expression of someone confronting something that was larger than he had imagined it would be, which Florence thought was the universal experience of first parenthood. "He looks like he has opinions," David said quietly. "He is going to fit in here very well then," Florence said. David looked at her over the baby's head with something so full and unguarded that Florence felt it like physical warmth, and he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the kind of tenderness that has forgotten to be careful because it is completely certain. They named him William Eleanor Rhodes, the Eleanor for the woman who had made the rest of it possible, and they told him the story of his middle name when he was old enough to understand it, which was sooner than they expected because William Rhodes turned out to be a child with a ferocious appetite for stories and an uncommon ability to sit still for them. Life moved as life does, in the interlocked rhythms of seasons and work and small pleasures and the occasional large event. The ranch prospered, modestly but steadily, which was the best kind of prospering. Florence's bookkeeping work expanded further as Cimarron grew, acquiring new businesses and new residents throughout the early 1880s, and she was eventually keeping accounts for 6 establishments and had taken on 2 younger women to assist her, teaching them the work with the same directness with which she had learned it. Margaret Torres remained one of the steadier presences of Florence's life, the friendship between them having matured from professional to something closer to the kind of sisterhood that builds between women who have found each other reliable. They had supper together every second Sunday when the weather allowed it, and Florence had helped Margaret when a dispute with a supplier had threatened to destabilize the general store, and Margaret had sat with Florence through William's second-year illness, a frightening week of high fever from which he recovered, but during which Florence had not slept for 4 days and had needed someone beside her who would not pretend it was certainly going to be fine. It was fine. He recovered fully and grew into a sturdy, cheerful boy who had his father's dark hair and his mother's precision of mind, and his own particular quality of enthusiastic attention to everything that moved or grew or made an interesting sound. Don Arturo Vasquez died in the summer of 1881, peacefully in his own house on his own confirmed land, at the age of 73. The whole of Cimarron came to the funeral, which Florence thought was a better accounting of a man than most monuments could offer. She wept at the graveside and was not embarrassed about it. He had told the truth about things, including the truth about her and David, and she had valued him for it. A daughter came to the Rhodes family in the autumn of 1882, smaller than William had been and fiercer about it, with a set to her jaw that David said was Florence's and Florence said was David's, and that was probably both of theirs, because the Rhodes family did not tend toward people who were easily redirected. They named her Josephine, which was nobody's name in particular, but which suited her immediately and completely. She had her grandmother Aliner's name as a middle name as well, continuing the tradition they had begun with William, the acknowledgement woven quietly into the life they had built. Thomas Hale found his own happiness in 1882, marrying a woman who had come to Cimarron as a schoolteacher from Denver, a quiet, sharp-minded woman named Ada who had the quality of seeing through social performance that Thomas found both alarming and deeply appealing. Florence liked her immediately, and the 4 of them formed a companionship of the kind that sustains people through years, built on honesty and the ability to disagree without injury, and the shared understanding that good company was one of life's more reliable pleasures. Lucia Vasquez became, over the years, the person Florence trusted most with the inside of her own mind. They had a friendship that had begun in frank mutual assessment, and had deepened through every kind of weather, the land-grant struggle and Don Arturo's death, and the fevers of children, and the ordinary difficult days that arrive without drama and require navigation anyway. Lucia was the person Florence told when something was hard, and the person she celebrated with when something was good, and the person who would say what was true without softening it in ways that obscured its usefulness. In the spring of 1883, Florence stood on the porch of the Rhodes ranch house, watching the climbing roses come into their full bloom, the pink and white of them against the adobe, the mountains white-capped behind the wide sweep of the valley going green, and she felt the fullness of it as something that could be accurately measured, not idealized, not glossed. The full weight of it, including everything that had been hard, the crossing, the deception and its consequences, the year of finding out who she was in this place, and who he was, and whether the 2 of them fit in the ways that actually mattered, The worrying over children and finances and the ongoing unfairness of a world that distributed its goods unequally. And then, resting under all of that like bedrock, the simple, unambiguous fact of being loved by someone who knew her and had chosen her and went on choosing her. David came out onto the porch with coffee, in the way he had come out with coffee for 4 years now, and stood beside her looking at the mountains and the roses and the spring morning with the comfortable ease of a man who knows exactly where he is. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Florence took the coffee. She turned the question over in the way she turned all real questions over, giving it the honest attention it deserved. Then she said, "I am thinking about a room with a window that faces east. And how I am glad it was not empty." David put his arm around her shoulder and she leaned into his side, and the mountains were very still in the morning light, and the roses were in full bloom, and inside the house she could hear William's footsteps on the wooden floor, the heavy, purposeful footsteps of a 3-year-old boy on important business of his own, and the smaller accompanying sound of Josephine pulling herself upright against the table to follow him. "I am glad it was not empty too," David said. They stood there together on the porch they had both come to, from different directions and through different difficulties. The man who had built the room and the woman who had traveled across 3 territories to find it. And the morning was clear and warm, and the roses climbed the adobe in the particular determined way of things that have found their place and have no intention of growing anywhere else. The name on the land deed read David and Florence Rhodes, in the neat, careful hand of the Cimarron County clerk who had recorded it the previous year when they had added 40 acres on the east side of the original property. And Florence had looked at the name, her name, the name she had borrowed and been given back and had finally, honestly, come to own, and had felt the clean, quiet satisfaction of a thing properly settled. She had crossed 3 territories alone to claim it. The man who owned it had looked at her in the yard of his house, with the morning light on the mountains and his sister's brooch in his hand, and had said, "Come inside." Which was, Florence had long since decided, his way of saying keep it. And she had. And she did. And the east-facing window caught the morning light every day, and the climbing roses came back every spring, and the valley held them both, steady and deep-rooted, in the country they had chosen and the life they had made together, which was, by any honest measure, exactly enough.